Leemon Baird, welcome to Hidden Forces.
Oh, thank you for having me.
So what's changed since I had you last on the show? That was late September, early October.
Oh, yeah. So just interest has exploded. We have had an enormous number of people that have been interested in watching us. They go to our Telegram channel that has expanded out to thousands of people. I don't even know how many. We have a great deal of interest. And, things like your program are part of that, and I appreciate it.
So I've noticed that there exists some misunderstandings. There remain some misunderstandings. In fact, they've been heightened in some way, given the fact that you have now sort of come out into the public and there's more awareness of Hashgraph. What do you think some of those major sort of misunderstandings are about Hashgraph and how it works and where it falls within the domain of distributed ledger technology?
Oh, sure. So, everything is complicated. All of these systems are complicated. There's lots of misunderstandings about all of them. And people will just look at a picture and they'll say, oh, you are based on circles and lines. Well, you must be like every other system that's based on circles and lines, everything that uses a directed acyclic graph. Well, no, actually, you can have radically different things that are both using circles and lines. That's not really a core thing. So, yeah, we have a directed acyclic graph, but we're actually fairly different from the other ones. I mean, in what the graph is and how we use it and what it means, we're fairly different in those ways. Also, at the moment, we have permissioned ledgers. We're doing permissioned ledgers, and we have customers, and we're distributing those, and we're developing those. And a lot of people ask, so when's your ICO? Well, ICO actually would be something on a non-permissioned ledger, a public ledger. Or they'll say, explain to me how your public ledger works. Well, we don't actually have one. We're doing permission ledgers right now. And maybe in the future we will, but we don't have anything yet that we're talking about. So, I can't tell you how it works. It doesn't exist.
Well, I've heard a lot of people say this is like IOTA. It's just another DAG.
Yes.
What are the main distinctions between IOTA? Because there are many, and certainly the virtual voting is one obvious one.
Yes.
How would you explain to an audience the difference between IOTA and Hashgraph?
Yeah, well, everything about them is different. They both use a DAG, which is a math term, a directed acyclic graph, DAG. But aside from that, they have nothing in common. So the DAG is usually drawn as a picture with circles with lines between them. We both have that. You could even put arrows on them. People usually don't. But the circles mean something different, and the lines mean something different, and what we do with it means something different, and the way we use it is different, and the results are different. So, everything is different. In IOTA, the circles represent, there's transactions in the circles, but then you look at their ancestors, and each circle is in some sense at a tip representing its ancestors, a whole set of transactions. And when you connect it, the lines, you're sort of choosing which sets you want to approve of. That's kind of what's going on. But in Hashgraph, it's totally different. The circles represent the event of you calling me up and telling me things. And so the lines just say whenever somebody comes and tells me something, I draw a line to the last thing they said and the last thing I said. And so then our graph, our picture of the circles and lines, is a history of how we've talked to each other. And that's what it is. It isn't saying which sets I like better than other sets. It isn't saying what I approve and what I disapprove of. It's simply letting you know everyone I've talked to and when I talk to them and when they talk to people and when they talk to them. And that's sort of weird, right? That's not what these other systems are doing. But when you do that, it lets you get consensus really fast with these amazing math proofs because we're gossiping about gossip. That's just weird. Everybody does gossip, but gossiping about gossip is very strange. And our DAG represents the gossip about gossip. It's the history of how we've talked to each other. So it's very different from what you would see. And the funny thing is, by doing things in such a radically different way, we're able to go back to our roots of 30 years ago and use those really old algorithms and actually make them efficient. What we do is you can run now one of those really old voting algorithms, but without any voting, which is a contradiction in terms, but that's what we do. Because we have this whole history, I just pretend that you're voting and I get the same results. And the results are really strong math.
So for some of these alternatives like IOTA, consensus happens, or the process of consensus occurs on the network as part of the communication.
The communication is you could say that. I mean, but that's a way of saying it. Another way of saying it is that they're remembering different things than we're remembering, and they're using it in different algorithms than we're using it. And so we both get to some kind of consensus, but it's a different kind of consensus. This is asynchronous Byzantine, and those are other kinds of consensus. And so if you're worried about attackers, if you don't want to trust everybody, then your best bet that you can get is asynchronous Byzantine with the 1/3. That's the best that math will allow you to do, and that's what we do.
So let's talk about security a little bit, because
Sure.
you're basically bringing it up there, and it's something I want to talk to you about.
Sure.
That is, I think, for you, even though your throughput is so high, your potential throughput is so high with Hashgraph, and there's the fairness of ordering transactions, which is a big one.
Yeah.
Security, for me, it appears is your sort of biggest thing, your biggest concern. Am I correct in that? And if so, what is sort of unique about Hashgraph that makes it so secure?
I understand. So from the beginning, the one thing we wouldn't compromise on was security. So, 5 years ago, I wanted to be able to do shared worlds, which ends up being something like ledgers and cryptocurrencies and all these things we're talking about. I had a slightly different vision, though. But you had to have speed and you had to have security. But if I had to give up one, I would give up everything else. I had to have security, which is why I kept convincing myself it was just impossible. I was saying, well, if I can't have asynchronous Byzantine and then do it fast, then I just won't do it at all. I've got to have the asynchronous Byzantine. But what does that mean? So first of all, you don't want things like double spending. That would be bad. And that all comes from when we're coming to a consensus, an agreement on the order of the transactions, but you think we have one order and I think we have a different order. That's a disaster. We've got to stop that. We also, though, if we're going to be doing something important on our network, and I think eventually the whole world is going to be running on these networks, these ledgers, DLTs, if we're going to do something important, we have to make sure that we aren't so fragile that our entire network can be shut down by shutting down one computer. And that matters a lot. So for example, in today's age, we have botnets doing distributed denial of service attacks on people. And some hacker will get into printers and web cameras and baby monitors and little tiny computers all around the world, take them over, and you say, well, I don't care if someone takes over my printer, it doesn't really hurt me. Well, sure. But if they take over 1 million devices and they have all those 1 million devices flood one computer with messages, for as long as that flood is going, that computer is essentially disconnected from the world. And that's what we have to defend against.
And that's a huge challenge, right? You're talking about the revolution in what can be done with botnets in an IoT universe, where you've got these dumb devices that are connected to the internet and that can be easily compromised and then used as part of a botnet to larger, more significant attack.
That's right.
How important is that to you in terms of being an urgent thing that needs to be addressed?
It's urgent. And you said IoT. We don't even have the IoT yet, and we're already in serious trouble. So last fall, we had the Dyn attack where they were shutting down, Netflix for several hours. Do you think Netflix minds when their servers go down in North America for several hours? They probably mind. It attacked Amazon. Do you think Amazon minds if their servers go down for a while? It probably matters.
Pretty sure they do.
I'm pretty sure they do. And this is bad. And this was actually, in that case, they were attacking the DNS system. They weren't even attacking Netflix and Amazon. They were able to wipe them out by attacking the DNS system. Okay. The whole internet is extremely fragile right now.
I've heard that, yeah.
This is bad. There are lots of people trying to fix it, but it's hard because the internet's big and it's hard to fix. So denial of service attacks are here now. They are happening all the time. I have read that if you go to the mafia or somebody, you can buy bots on the botnet for some number of dollars or cents per bot. I don't know what the price is, but you can actually go rent computers and then flood people with packets, which by the way is a felony. Don't do this at home. This is a bad thing, and they take it very seriously because our whole civilization runs on these things, and now there's a way of attacking them. Now let's be clear as we go to the world of distributed ledgers. And in a lot of ways, the DLTs are becoming popular because the internet is so vulnerable. This is one of the ways we're fixing the internet, is we're inventing DLTs that now fix these problems. If you have 1,000 computers running or 1 million computers running in your DLT network, and a botnet is big enough to shut them all down, then you're out of luck. Your network gets shut down. If they can shut down half of your nodes, you're probably out of luck. But if they can just shut down one node and shut down your whole network, that's a problem. That's a flaw in your network. So yeah, if they shut down your whole network, you're going to be out of luck, but that's not a flaw in your network. That's just life. But if they can shut down one at a time, that's bad. We've got to not have that. And a lot of systems have that problem.
Which is interesting because you're bringing us now to a conversation about, in a way, we're kind of touching on something that I do want to talk about, which is the history of the early internet and the way in which security has become a much bigger issue as the internet has scaled.
Yes.
And in some ways, what you and others are trying to do with DLT, with distributed consensus, is to solve the problem of scalability for distributed computing, storage, and computation.
Yes.
And adding a whole level of security to the internet that doesn't exist, that wasn't part of it when it was originally conceived in the late 60s and 70s, and then really came into commercial use in the 80s and 90s.
You've got it. That's exactly right. So the internet was made from the beginning to be resilient to accidental faults, and it has grown rapidly. It is enormous now, but we have a lot of problems. We have problems with these botnets we talked about. You have problems with spam. Have you ever received a spam? You have. Amazing. I can't believe it. Nigerian dictators keep wanting to give me money. It's wonderful. Actually, it's not wonderful. And our phone system is also not wonderful because it also was designed a long time ago, even before the internet. And it has problems with spoofing of phone numbers that's very hard to stop because the exchanges have to trust each other in various ways. So we have a very large insecure system, and it is very hard to change. Even going from IPv4 to IPv6, just changing a little tiny detail of how you do addresses on the internet has been taking us years and years and years, and we still haven't fully deployed it. It's really hard to make changes. DLTs have come along. These ledgers, these blockchains have come along and are saying, fine, we're going to build something on top of the internet with all its flaws, but we're going to be so resilient that we actually overcome some of the flaws. And so instead of setting up a server on the internet that might get shut down, I'm going to stand up 1,000 servers, and you'd have to shut down a lot of them before they shut down. It gives you security that you don't have with the current internet. And so we are really building a trust layer on top of the internet, where these DLTs can become the trust layer of the internet, which solves a lot of our problems. If everybody uses them, you actually can solve problems like spam very easily. If everybody sends their emails through a trusted system, then we could actually eliminate spam pretty easily. And even in the long term, these things will be able to reach down and change the underlying internet itself to be more secure. For example, you can do things with microtransactions and other things to make it more secure. But that's the long-term thing. But for right now, what we're doing is we're building things that sit on top of the internet and give you more security than you'd have with the internet by itself.
So that's been sort of the dream with a lot of blockchain enthusiasts.
Yes.
But there's some challenges to blockchain as a distributed ledger technology.
Yeah.
So in this specific example that we're describing, microtransactions, this and other, what are the other, what are the most obvious cases where blockchain simply has, in your view, and in the view of others, limitations in its capacity to scale to the use cases that are needed to solve the problems we're describing?
Okay, so of course, all of our ledgers have started off small, and we're going to scale over time, and everybody is working to scale them in various ways. And I think Hashgraph has a nice way of scaling it. Other people are trying to scale these other systems. So I'm not going to say these current systems are bad because they haven't scaled. Everybody knows that. What we need to do is improve it. But let me just talk about some of the problems that we have to think about. Let's put it that way. Okay? The problems that Hashgraphs have to think about, the problems that these other systems have to think about. Some of these are inherent in the consensus algorithm. Some of them are inherent in the layers above that when you want to build a big public system. But there's a lot of problems that we need to think about. So if you like, we just kind of go through some of the problems.
Let's go through them. And also, it would be good for you to draw that distinction between the consensus layer and the additional layers, because I think there's a lot of misunderstanding in the public around how complicated a non-permission network is. A public ledger would be in relation to a permission network.
So the consensus algorithm, just trying to put things in order and put timestamps on them in a good way, is itself an incredibly complicated field with a 35-year-old literature and thousands of papers published on it and lots of different algorithms competing just for that component of the consensus. And the Hashgraph consensus algorithm is just that component. Then you use that as a component in something bigger, like the Swirlds platform is a little bit bigger and you build apps on it, or some of these big platforms, these public ledgers, for example, are really big. And they have lots of layers on top of consensus. But wait, isn't consensus enough? Shouldn't that be all you have to worry about? Not quite. There are other things you want to think about when you want to build the whole stack. For example, you're going to have to think about how would we do a cryptocurrency? And how are we going to deal with it? And how are we going to, is the money supply fixed or not? How are we going to deal with the security of allowing insecure people to be part of the network? How do you become a full node? And how do we protect ourselves against that in Sybil attacks and firewall attacks and other things? And interesting attacks of game theory upon economy-based systems. And then once we have figured that out, we also have to figure out, well, how are we going to incentivize people? How do you incentivize the full nodes to do the right thing, even if somebody might be bribing them to do the wrong thing? How do you make sure that the incentive structures work well? And then how do we make sure that this whole ecosystem doesn't have all the problems that the real ecosystems have? You know, we have stock market crashes all the time. How do you stop that? And that's just the cryptocurrency. Then we have to figure out how we're going to do our smart contracts and worry about various things with timing and latency and throughput and how you store data and stuff for the smart contracts and how you make those reliable. And then we're going to have to talk about how do clients that are not full nodes connect to this network and use it. And what's the APIs and things going to be with them? And we have to think about file storage. Do we store everything on the chain? Do we have chains and side chains? But do we have DHCs and hash tables to store things? Does everyone have every file, or do we have certain files in certain people? And then if you're going to do that, we have to think about things like revocation. How do we make sure that the ledger as a whole doesn't show you that the file hasn't been deleted when it shows me the file has been deleted? How do we have agreement? We can have agreement by all having the same set of files, but then what if we don't want to do that? Which just gets into this other thing of sharding. How do you take, if you have 100 nodes, they should all do the same thing, they all have everything. If you have 10 million nodes, don't do that. You can get speed-ups by clustering them and having the clusters talk to each other. But then you have all the questions, they're called shards. The word comes from the database community. But then you have all these questions. Do we have shards that persist for long periods, or do we have a new shard every second? Just a random subset of the pool. And how do the shards talk to each other? And what's the responsibilities of shards? And why should one shard trust another shard? And how do we ensure that we have things like revocation that's broadcast across all the shards? And how do you deal with the latency problems with the shards and the throughput problems with the shards? Lots of other things. And then I told you that just the little tiny part of consensus is an enormous field. What kind of security do you want? Do you want asynchronous Byzantine, or are you willing to settle for something less? With the sharding system, you have to say, well, even if I had asynchronous Byzantine at the building block level, even if my brick is really good, is my brick house very good?
Exactly.
I don't know. It's possible to have really secure, strong bricks, but build a very weak brick wall out of them. Or it's possible to have really strong bricks and build a strong brick wall out of them. So you got to make sure you do that. On the other hand, if you have a weak brick, it's pretty much impossible to build a strong brick wall.
So this is great because you're getting into, again, we're dancing around these questions of security and throughput, which are the two trade-offs that you're really working in through your mind on.
Gotta have them.
You're starting with a really solid foundation, but you're still building. There's still a lot more to build, and all that provides an opportunity for making mistakes in security and also for losing on throughput.
Absolutely. So at every layer, it's going to tend to slow you down, and you got to fight to be fast. And at every layer, there's a possibility for new bugs being introduced. The history of the internet that you talked about, if it taught us anything, it's that you could have serious security bugs and protocols that last for years and years and years, and no one even noticed it. And I'm not even talking about bugs in the code. I'm talking about bugs in the protocols themselves. And the only solution to that is to have actual math proofs. And the real only solution is to have math proofs that are checked by a computer. And we now have 2 employees in our company doing that, building math proofs that can be checked by a computer that the algorithms are right and everything's right. And you have to worry about this at every layer. And every time you add another layer, you have to worry about it, about throughput and about security and about fairness, which we haven't been talking much about. But you got to preserve that at all the layers as well. Everything you have to worry about to preserve at all the layers.
Well, I do want to talk about fairness, and we'll get into that. But this is also fascinating for me because thinking about how you're imagining architecting this system and the challenges that you're going to confront as you move forward. I assume you don't encounter them all, at least in your head chronologically. You're able to skip ahead and think about what are going to be the most challenging ones. Are there particular layers that you feel are the most challenging? And are there good sort of guideposts and examples of companies or technologies that have come before that have tried to do this or have done it to the best of their ability that you can look at for guidance? And is there anything, what's your thought process there?
Okay, so which layer is the hardest one to get right? That's easy. All of them. It really is. That's what makes this fun, is that it's all complicated. And you can't even think about any of the pieces in isolation. You have to start thinking about all the pieces. When you're building one piece, you have to think about how all the other ones are going to fit with it. That just makes this fun. It also makes it challenging. And you talked about all the different layers and things we have to talk to. Just a second ago, I was going through the various problems you have to solve. I only got halfway through the various problems. There's a lot more.
I'm sure there are.
And they're even above the technical. I mean, I was just talking about technical things, but you also have legal and social and political and organizational and regulatory, and there's other things. And we can talk more about those too. Those are fun things too. So you have this enormous stack of interesting problems, and you want to build a huge stack of interesting solutions. You said, are there any examples? Well, just randomly choosing one, the one you had is a great example. The internet. Turns out the internet's a lot more complicated than it looks. And when they were first struggling with how do you even build an internet, they did what computer scientists do. We say abstraction is the solution. Let's break it into layers. And so we teach every computer science student the 7-layer model. And then I've seen beautiful posters that show how there's a lot of different networks in existence, and not one of them has 7 layers. Not one. But we teach everybody, well, there's the 7 layers. And then every network we stuff into those 7 layers. It doesn't actually match well. But what is true is that anybody who wants to build an internet or a particular type of network has to figure out these layers. You can do different things at different layers, from the very medium with where the electrons go up to low-level protocols, and then protocols on top of that, and protocols on top of that. And you have to get the bugs out at every layer. And that's exactly the process we're doing with ledgers right now. We're seeing advances at every layer of the stack. We're seeing people build giant stacks. We're seeing people focus on little pieces. A lot of the big stacks being built now are intentionally pluggable and modular, so that people can come along with a better brick and stick it into the wall at the right spot.
So that's interesting. This raises a question, which is how important is collaboration and teamwork, and sort of how many people do you envision having to be involved in a process like this to really get it right?
Yeah. So in some sense, the best way to do anything is to have lots of small teams that are all working on these problems. You don't want to have just one person working on a problem. You want to have lots of different people taking lots of different approaches to see what works best. But for the particular team, you want to have a fairly small team. So, the Skunk Works is a small one inside of a big company, and they built really cool airplanes and things. So Air Force examples. But you want to have small teams that can innovate quickly and move quickly and be agile. Startups are wonderful. I've started a bunch of startups, and I really like startups, and that's fun. And big companies that have been super successful are organized to sort of have lots of startups inside themselves. So I think Google has done a fantastic job of this. But all the big ones, Apple and everybody, is doing a good job of this. And then these small teams, it all comes down to getting good people with the right culture, where you all are excited about what the ultimate goal is. Not just making money, or not just working 9 to 5 and going home, but really into the thing you're trying to make. And then thinking outside the box. What is the best way to do this? What are different ways of doing it that we haven't thought of before? The key to creativity is think about how to solve the problem. Then when you have a solution, keep thinking of more solutions and comparing them and so on. And so you want to build the culture. And in a startup, this is the most important thing in a startup, is who you have. I mean, the people are the important thing, not the ideas, not the algorithms. The important thing for Swirlds isn't Hashgraph, it's the people we have in Swirlds. And so right now we're hiring a whole bunch of people, but we're really fighting to get our very first people to be people that will have a culture that is excited about what we're trying to accomplish. That's really what we need. Smart people, hardworking people that are really committed to accomplishing the goals that we're trying to get to change the world in good ways. That's what we need.
Further in the conversation, I want to talk about this because one of the things I want to talk to you about is culture and also values, and what your values are and what your goals are with Hashgraph. Before we do, let's close off this one part with the technology. You and I have talked about this before on Hidden Forces when you came on the program. We talked about the challenges to scale with speed, throughput, and fairness.
That's right.
We talked a little bit about security. Let's talk about speed and fairness.
Yeah. So security is, I think, the whole purpose of ledgers. If you didn't need security, you just use a server. Why bother? But security by itself isn't enough if you're too slow. And if you're unfair, there's some things you can't do. So speed is important. If you can only do one transaction a second, you can change the world. There are absolutely really important things. I could give you examples, but storing deeds for land right now is a nightmare. And if you could put it into a ledger, that's a beautiful thing. And maybe one transaction a second would be enough if you're only doing this for one county. That'd be fine. So you can change the world at one transaction per second. But you can't do everything that needs to be done. 90% of what we want to do, or 99% of what we do, needs more than that. If you can do 1,000 a second, that's much better. If you can do 10,000 a second, you can do credit card. Credit card transactions for the whole planet can be 10,000 a second. That's not bad. If you can do 100,000 a second or hundreds of thousands, that's even better. And that's what we're doing, is that kind of speed. And that is important in one shard. I'll get to that in a second. But if you can do hundreds of thousands in one shard, this is important for a lot of applications where you really want high throughput. So there are applications where, even a game or a stock market or any high throughput thing is going to need this kind of thing. I said 1 second would be enough for recording land deeds for a county. Great. How about land deeds for North America? maybe you need more than 1 a second. Maybe you really do need hundreds of thousands a second. I don't know. So the faster you can go, each order of magnitude, every time you get 10 times faster, it opens up whole new vistas of things you can do that you couldn't do before.
Stock exchanges,
cryptocurrencies, credit card payments, online video games, World of Warcraft. How often does a character move in World of Warcraft? More than 10 times a second. It's hundreds of thousands of times a second. You need these kinds of throughputs. And so this is important. And the funny thing is, I said in a single shard. So just like computers can be made faster by having more processors in your computer, you can make a ledger faster by having more ledgers in your ledger, the little clusters, the shards. But you know what? Not every program gets faster when you put more CPUs in your computer. And not every application gets faster when you run it on multiple shards. It's the same thing. And so right now, what does a typical desktop computer has? It has a CPU that's really fast that only has a few cores, and then it has a GPU that has thousands of little computers in it. But the thousands of little computers can't do everything well, but they can do graphics. Same thing. What you want to do when you build a big system is have lots of shards, so that for those things that can afford to be on lots of shards, it'll be super fast. But for applications that really need to all be in one shard, you want your shard to be fast too. That is the end of the first half. You asked about speed and fairness. That's why speed matters. And everybody agrees that speed matters. It's obvious that speed matters. And that's what we're doing.
And okay, so and we'll probably get into fairness and transaction ordering in some of the use cases. So let's actually go there. What I wanted to ask you are the most immediate, promising, exciting opportunities and use cases for Hashgraph and other DLTs that could scale in permission networks. I've had some just off the top of my head. I was thinking about, you've got StubHub, for example, which you have all these sports teams that use a third-party broker for tickets. I think it's an example of a perfect use case. These companies would love to have something that they all have a piece of that they can use, that they can have transactions on, that's running on distributed ledger. Same thing with the airlines. Same things with games, video games. Same thing with stock exchanges. And then, of course, there are particularly governments and other small organizations or private companies in developing economies, which I could see huge opportunities for. What excites you the most, and what do you think are some of the most obvious and perhaps even easiest to deploy, taking into account we talked about speed, security, and we haven't mentioned exactly fairness, but this would be a good time to talk a little bit about what fairness is as well in this context.
This is great. So let's talk about permission networks. Now, what is a permission ledger? Permission ledger means you have to have permission to run one of the full nodes. Now, you may actually be providing services to the public. So it's not necessarily hidden and private and secret and locked behind a brick wall. That doesn't necessarily have to be permissioned. Permission just means you have to have permission to be a full node, to be one of the computers that's running the network, that has the transactions, that are approving them, that are storing the data. So you gave some examples of where a small number of vendors want to be providing things to the public. They would run the nodes in the permission network, and then anyone in the public could just call up one of those nodes and buy a ticket. Or I forgot what the other examples you had was. Airlines, you said. So you could just connect to one of the airlines and see which seats are free, and you can buy a ticket or something. So that's an example of a permissioned network. You don't have permissioned uses of it, but you have a permissioned network. In addition, you have permissioned networks that really are secret. And in the financial services industry, and in, any industry where you care about keeping secrets, or you really care about security so much that you don't want even the hackers to be able to spy on you, then you really do want all your stuff to be secret, which means you want every node that has a copy of all your data to be permissioned, and you want all the communication between them to be encrypted. It's really important. You want it to be secure. And so in our Swirlds stuff, we use really strong encryption. It's actually what's required for protecting top secret information. It's the CNSA suite is what we're compliant with. So we have strong encryption, but we also have these permission networks. So you have two different kinds of permission networks. What can you use them for? Anytime people want to share information and possibly don't even trust each other. So you said the stock market. You could do the New York Stock Exchange, but probably people trust the New York Stock Exchange Incorporated to run their servers. That's probably okay. But you know what? There's something called a dark pool, which is a little stock market. There's a whole bunch of dark pools that are little tiny stock markets run by just a few banks, and all they're doing is buying and selling to each other. That is the perfect example of something you do as a permission network. Why not just have one of the banks stand up a server? Honestly, the other banks don't trust them. I mean, it really is the truth. And right now they do it that way because that's the only way you can do it. And there's evidence that sometimes they take advantage of their privileged position in ways that they shouldn't. If it were a ledger, then each of the banks involved in it is exactly equal and everyone can trust each other. The only way it could be compromised is if a full third of the banks were to gang up on the rest and do something evil. And probably they're going to get caught, therefore they're not going to do that.
Right.
Well,
that's a good point. I mean, we saw this in the financial crisis. You're talking about, you're touching on the OTC derivatives market, over-the-counter deals with banks and bringing transparency to that.
Transparency.
That's a huge thing.
Huge.
So in that context, have you thought about examples like in the banking sector, when you're thinking about this, when you're talking to some of these companies?
Yeah.
Do you have a sort of a pitch about how much you think you can save them with what you're doing?
Yeah. So right now, the financial services industry is very interested in blockchains and ledgers to begin with. And we've been having, mostly our biz dev is we just answer the phone. We've been having lots of people calling us. They hear about us and they're calling us. And they're really interested in this stuff.
That's a great biz dev
it's a great biz dev model. Yeah, answer
just sit by the phone. Just
sit by the
people
phone.
Sit by the phone. You've seen a big jump in your in interest in Hashgraph, I assume, in the last few months?
It's amazing the flow that we're getting. It's just incredible. Yeah, that's why we're hiring people, is because it's just amazing. But what we find is that they are interested in being able to set up systems between, say, several financial institutions, and we're talking about banks and credit cards and credit unions and insurance companies and everybody that deals with money. Payment services. We're talking about all these kinds of people in this field, and people involved in stocks, and people involved in all sorts of things like that. For these people, what they want to be able to do is they want to be able to have a small number of very trusted parties, sometimes just 3 or 4, where really it's just 2 people doing something. You want to have a couple of others that are sort of standing by as witnesses. That's really what we're dealing with. They want to be able to jointly sign a contract and never be able to pretend that they hadn't signed it. They want to have everybody know that it's real. They want to be able to transfer assets to each other. They want to be able to share information with each other. Now, of course, you could say, well, they're competitors. Why would they share information? Well, if someone's attacking you, you might want to tell me so that I can be prepared when they try to attack me. We're just doing each other a favor. Well, we need to know information about that. Some of these threats that are going on. There's all sorts of cases where we are collaborating with each other, or look at supply chains, where you have a factory is building widgets and they need some parts, and you have a parts supplier. Maybe the factory needs to get stuff from the parts supplier. And then maybe you have several factories and several parts suppliers. Ooh, that's different. Because now we need to start matching up buyers and sellers. We have multiple buyers and multiple sellers, and we have to start matching them up, which means you need fairness. And so instead of just having one particular bank do all the matching, or one particular factory do all the matching, which maybe we don't trust, you have a DLT. And if it has fairness, then you can start doing the matching up, and you can do your supply chains management in various ways this way. But what you find is that you need speed and you need fairness. And for reasons that I'm not even sure I understand, we're finding that our customers are more interested in the speed than the fairness. And they're more interested in the speed than the security even. They say, yeah, well, security is important too. But really what we want is the speed. But we can do that. But the truth is, when we sit down with them and talk to them long enough, they say, oh yeah, that security thing is important too.
That's very interesting that they don't think initially that that's so important. It makes sense in a way because it explains much of what we see in terms of the compromised networks.
Okay, I am slandering their good names. Let me explain a little bit better. We're talking about institutions that put half their money into security to begin with. And they tell you, I already trust my computer because it's in a bank vault and I spend millions on making it the most secure system on earth. So that's why I'm not worried about security. I've already taken care of it.
And they understand, I assume, immediately that they could save a tremendous amount of money on security. That's the whole sort of idea.
This can happen as well. Basically what I do is I say, there's some additional threat models you haven't talked about, you haven't thought about, like denial of service attacks, and we can give you security against that too. And then when they start thinking about it, they say, oh yeah, that's important too.
So what about problems of the commons, problems that are traditionally solved by governments? What can we do in that domain with this type of technology? And then also for governments currently, are you looking at use cases for the public sector itself to see if you can make this technology available?
Yes. So you can have... So I talked about things like recording deeds. You could absolutely imagine governments doing this. And actually we're in talks with people that are talking about recording land. They're not government, but they would be working with governments. I mean, there's things that governments are interested in that. There's interesting things in Health records, that's not government, but it's all HIPAA controlled and government regulated and very much intertwined with how the government works. You could talk about doing things like elections. You could set up fair elections, especially maybe in a third world country where there isn't a huge infrastructure for setting up fair elections. You could set up fair elections. There's no panacea. If bad guys can invade all the homes and hold a gun to people's heads and make them vote a certain way, then you're out of luck, right? This is not a silver bullet that solves all problems. Just like I said, we can't solve all DDoS problems, but we can make you less fragile.
Well, this brings it home, right? Especially in the context of the American elections and all these conversations around fake news and the compromise in the elections. Talking about, putting guns to people's heads. The one thing that we didn't have a chance to discuss when we were talking about security before was the 51% attack, the way it's described in the Bitcoin community. You guys have a 33% threshold, and that's something that you feel. Yeah. Exactly. So,
sure.
So let's talk a little bit about that as well, right?
Yeah.
Because this is a good opportunity. We forgot about that.
Yeah.
Let's talk a little bit about what your metric for and threshold is for security, how it applies to the Bitcoin network,
sure,
and what sort of, mathematically speaking, makes you more secure.
The answer is there's a lot of attacks in this world. Some of them need 51%. Some of them only need 34% on every system. In fact, there's a math theorem. There are theorems that say every one of these systems, if you want to be asynchronous Byzantine, there's a 34% attack on you. So Bitcoin has it too. In fact, just yesterday, I was giving a talk at Harvard. They recorded it. It'll be on the web somewhere. And I explained in detail how any network, including Bitcoin, can be attacked with a 34% attack. And the thing is when you don't think about it, it's because you're not thinking about the bad guys are creative. For example, maybe the bad guys corrupt some firewalls. There's firewalls. Some countries have a firewall around the whole country. What if a bad guy controls it? It's a bunch of computers that filter the data going through it. That's what it is. What if the bad guys take care of it, or if the person who owns it is a bad guy, or whatever, and for whatever reason they decide to cut it off, and the computers inside the country can't talk to the computers outside the country? Or what if you are on an island that only has one fiber to your island and somebody hacks into that? They either cut it, or they install a box that does weird filtering and weird things. If you're in a world that has firewalls, then you can do 34% attacks. And I can go through the details of it. It's not all that hard. I now have 2 recorded talks with videos online that explain how it works. But it works for any system. Any system is vulnerable to 34%.
What are those 2? Why don't you give those out to our audience so that they can check those out?
Sure. The Crypto Economics Conference at Berkeley, I gave a talk there. And I spent a good amount of time put up pictures that shows how a 34% attack works. There, I think I was actually talking about a proof of work system. But it actually applies to everything when you think about it. And it's really simple. If you can put a firewall around a third of us, and then a third of us are evil, and the third that are evil are collaborating with the firewall, then they can talk through the firewall, but the good guys can't. So on the outside, a third of us are good guys, and a third of us are bad guys. 2/3 of the world are outside the firewall talking and making their own chain. Inside the firewall, a third of us are good guys, and that same third of us that are bad guys get to talk inside the firewall too, because they're allowed to go through the firewall. And so we have 2/3 of us talking on the inside, building their own chain. Well, that's bad. So now Bitcoin has 2 different chains. You can do double spending, one on each side, because the bad guys are making each side think that they're a full 2/3 of the world, even though they're actually 2 different worlds. And we have 2 different chains being built. That attack works on everything, not just Bitcoin. I mean, it works on everything.
And there's also, of course, the economics of proof of work that can cause clustering of computing power.
Okay, that's specific to proof of work. Right. If it's expensive to build your mining rig and there's economies of scale, then you're going to end up over time, you would expect, having fewer and fewer miners. And if it is expensive to have all the electricity to feed these computers, then you would expect over time to have geographic consolidation where everybody moves where the electricity is cheap. And at that same conference, the Berkeley conference, you asked for the second one. The second one is my talk at Harvard at the business school. That was yesterday, November, I guess. So in the public network, I said one of the issues you have to deal with is incentivizing. We didn't even get through all the issues on that. But incentivizing is a big one. For the permission side, incentivizing is almost never a problem. If I am allowing a bunch of credit unions to share threat information, then they're incentivized to run a node because it lets them see the threat information. If they don't run a node, they don't get to find out. Why do I come to the party? Because I want to be at the party. That's my incentive. The party itself is my incentive. So incentivizing is really easy, as long, of course, as you're cheap. If you had some expensive proof of work thing, then maybe it wouldn't be worth it to you. But as long as you don't have some expensive thing, if it's cheap to run a node, if your cell phone could be a node, then there's no downside to running a node. And if you get to see all the information, that's an upside. So, just being a node is its own reward in many cases. Or if it's, say, a distributed game, well, you get to play the game. That's your reward. That's why you want to be one of the nodes. And it doesn't cost much. Your laptop is perfectly powerful enough, or your cell phone is perfectly powerful enough. That's the incentive. Or if you're doing, well, all these things. If it's a dark pool, the only reason one of these organizations joins a dark pool is because they want to be able to trade stocks. And if they're not one of the nodes, they can't trade the stocks. So for permission networks, incentives typically are really easy to handle. It's its own incentive. For a public network, it's this big complicated thing. And there's lots of game theory, and there's lots of economic theory, and there's lots of interesting math, and it's a fun problem. Fun, by the way, to a mathematician means hard.
So that's great. So now we've talked about the use cases and we've talked about the technology. Something I want to get into is the culture of the blockchain community and distributed ledger technologies and the politics and the sort of social connectivity of all of that. And I also want to get into your vision and your goals and what your aims are with what you're doing and sort of what motivates you as well. But let's begin with that, because culture is such a big part of Bitcoin, particularly, right? It's a very libertarian, anarchic-friendly community. Ethereum is more commercial, or the applications are more commercial, and so there's a mindset that's more sort of functional in that regard. Are you aware of the culture in the blockchain community? Is that relevant to you, and how does that sort of apply to your sort of predispositions, the ideologies that you may have, or sort of how you view the world?
Yeah, so there's actually a whole bunch of different cultures going on here. And culture really is involved here 3 different ways. You have the culture of the people who are doing all this and why they're doing it. And then you have the questions about how do all of these issues affect the technology they're building and using and how they're using it. And then you have the question of how is that technology going to end up affecting the culture and social society and politics of the whole planet, which is also a really interesting question.
Really great. You just segmented this question in a really great way. Absolutely.
Yeah. So let's talk about that. So we have the culture of the people that are doing this stuff, and it's great. So we have a wide range, right? One of the earliest adopting communities seems to be the financial community, the suits, the bankers. And then you have these crypto-anarchists, which are somewhat not the same. And then you have everything in between. So it's this huge spectrum of people that are interested in ledgers. Why? Why are they interested in it? Because they understand that these ledgers have the ability to actually change the world. I mean, they're really going to make some major changes. And so there's this huge interest across the spectrum in it. And everyone is interested in it for a different reason. So how does their interest in it affect it? What their vision for the future is actually ends up affecting what they end up building. Or maybe it ends up affecting what they build up first. Eventually, everything wants to do everything, but it kind of affects what you build first. And so, some people are really interested in, I want a cryptocurrency because it's not a fiat and there's no government that controls it and it's free and there's no person who can inflate the money supply, and I don't like inflatable money supplies, and I want to be able to trust it, and I want to be able to have the freedom of digital transactions and not have to have something physical in my pocket. This is a whole driving force for interest in cryptocurrency. Then there's other people that are really interested in the fact that if we have a distributed ledger that gives us agreement and we have smart contracts on top of that, we could start doing things like having whole organizations that coordinate through this system and ensure the fairness and ensure that the rules are followed and so on without any central authority, but you could have the whole organization doing it. It almost changes the nature. Now, we already have voting in organizations. We have countries do voting and companies do voting, and clubs do voting, but you could have a whole different type of things where things maybe have strong anonymity, and there's a bunch of people that are interested in that aspect of all this. And then you have the people who are very interested in the fact that this will allow us to do all the things we've been doing in the past, but 1,000,000 times faster. If I send you a wire, it takes you days to get the money. That is insane. That is crazy. There's this thing called the internet that exists. Why does it take days for my wire to get to you if I try to wire you money? This is insane. And you could say, well, it's the evil banks that have done it, but the evil banks are not evil. They also are frustrated with the system. And it's a big, complicated system, and it's hard to change a big, complicated system. But a lot of people are looking at using ledgers to make it fast. There are people who are looking at ledgers to make, when you buy a house, you have to do a search to see if anybody else already owns that house. If the guy selling you actually owns it, or did he sell it to someone else yesterday? And that search itself is slow and expensive and error-prone. Wouldn't it be great if it were a ledger and it were all instant? If you want to play a game, you have to pay money right now. And so a kid that wants to play Minecraft has to pay Microsoft $10 a month if they want Microsoft to host it for them. And then only 11 kids can play at a time in that world. That little shared world only allows 11 kids at a time. And to a kid, $10 a month is a lot of money. Or they can host it themselves, but then one kid is the dictator that has complete control of the world. It would be great if you could just have shared worlds for free and not have to worry about paying for it. And everyone who's part of it is just part of it. And it can grow to 1 million people or it can be 3 people.
So I've heard you talk about this before, shared worlds, and that's in fact where Swirlds comes from, correct? The name of the company that drives the enterprise suite of software solutions based on Hashgraph.
That's it.
This is interesting because what you're describing is a utopian future where power is disintermediated, dispersed throughout the sort of community. It's really sort of the only way that we can think of that we can live in this increasingly intermediated technological future without losing control of our autonomy and our freedom.
Yes.
I don't know. I mean, I think about that often. Yeah. Do you think about that as well?
I do. So this is the real goal of our company. In fact, I said you want to get the first people to have the goal, have a common goal. Our goal is to make shared worlds. Let me explain. So what we want to be able to do, and I think a child born 20 years from now is just going to take for granted that you can do this. At any moment, you can wave your hand, you can create a world of your own. You don't have to pay anybody. You don't have to get permission. You don't have to think about which server is going to be holding it. You just, wave your hands and you have a world of your own. And you can put information there. You can build things. You can draw things. You can build 3D objects. You can have information stored. You can type in stuff. You can record stuff and it'll all be there. And it's just all magically there. And you can invite a friend. And now the two of you have a shared world. And you can see the same things. You can build things together. You can see each other. Of course, VR would play into this. Of course, games would play into this. Of course, social media would play into this. All these things would be part of it. But they're not even going to think about that. They're just going to say, I don't even know what social media is. I don't know what servers are. I just know that I wanted a shared world and I wanted to invite my friend. And now the two of us are in this shared world. This is it.
It's a remarkable vision that you're laying out. I'm interrupting for a minute, but just what you're really saying is that you can because the data layer is now a protocol, you're able to write this software that can do things that you couldn't do before because you distribute all of that computation and storage out to the network.
Yes, and it becomes invisible. That's the goal. What you end up with is you don't think about the network or about how you're going to transfer money and what servers are going to store your files and who is in control. Right now, there's always the admins that can control everything in a game or whatever. No, what you have is you just have rules enforced. You take it for granted. And if you want a world where there's a dictator, you could have one. But if you want a world where there's democracy, you can have that. It's entirely up to whatever you want. And you can invite a friend, or you can invite 1,000 friends. And all of you together then get to share all this data, and you all know that the rules are enforced. You know that there is fairness. If there's some kind of matching markets, you know that the markets are fair. You can just start up your own stock market. You don't have to say, I feel like having a stock market. You just wave your hand and you create a shared world and you have a stock market of your own that you're created.
I'm interrupting you again, Leemon, because you're getting me very excited, right? Because you're also making me think and imagine, right?
Yeah.
Which is, it's helpful for me to go back in time and go back to the early 90s and think about, and we talked about this before, and you mentioned it yourself, which is that it's not just about the culture that exists, but it's about the way in which the technology alters the culture.
Yes.
And the way in which those two things interplay with each other.
Yes.
The internet, the capacity to communicate across the world with anyone, and to now do video chat, it hasn't only just had an effect on our businesses and our capacity to change our economy, but it's also had an impact on our culture deeply, right? And if we can create, if you or anyone else can create a scalable solution for this, for what we're describing here, we're potentially talking about a future in which culture is dramatically different from what it is today as a result of our capacity to create spontaneously create these communities that are secure and that can work and operate without needing to have it hosted on Amazon servers.
Right. And because you don't have to host it on a server, you don't have to pay, or you don't have to watch ads, they don't have to spy on you to make the ads correct. So you don't have to have an entire industry based on spying on consumers.
So what does that do?
This is the future.
So what does that do? For example, do you
think
think
it gets better? Go ahead.
Well, I'm thinking, for example, a classic sort of limitation is in social networking. People are very frustrated with the ad model and with Facebook and many of these social networks. a glaringly obvious case, for example, would be the capacity to create social communities. I mean, that's kind of what you're talking about.
Exactly. Of course. But it's doing it the right way. Because you don't have to have a trusted third party running a server that's expensive, that needs to pay for it with ads, you don't have to have somebody spying on you. These shared worlds will take privacy for granted. That only what I publish is visible, it's only visible to those people in the world, and there's no corporation spying on me so that they can give me better ads, because there's no ads. And if you want to set up a world that has ads, fine. You can set up a shared world that has ads. That's fine. But the market controls, if people want to go to these free shared worlds that don't have ads, then they'll probably do that. So you're going to have to make your ads interesting enough to draw people in on purpose. Totally changes the nature of what social media are. It changes the nature of how we view what cyberspace is, what the internet is. That's what we're talking about. And I didn't even finish. Not only do I want us to be able to have these shared worlds, they have to connect to each other. We have 1 million shared worlds, but just without thinking about it, you wave your hand and part of your world is a part of Wikipedia. It appears like it's part of your world, even though it's actually over there in a different shared world. And when it changes, the changes propagate to yours invisibly. Or you just wave your hand and create a stock market, but people are going to buy, or an auction house, an eBay. But people are going to be buying and selling using real money. What's the real money? Oh, it's a cryptocurrency that's managed in some other shared world. But you just invisibly link them together. Everybody is linked invisibly, and you don't have to think about it. This is what we're talking about. And under the hood, there's constantly checking digital signatures and hashes and everything to make sure you're never lured into a false one. This is the vision for the future. This is where we have to get to. Now, it's a different vision than what motivates other people. Everyone has their own vision of what motivates them. And of course, this will incorporate everything else. We will have a cryptocurrency in this vision. We will have distributed autonomous organizations. We will have smart contracts, all that stuff. But that's not the vision.
That's just part of it. I mean, you're talking about an entirely new social organization for a digital society.
Exactly. And so it just changes the whole nature of what you view. And I think kids born 20 years from now won't even imagine a world where that isn't the case. But it's bigger than that.
What's exciting for me is maybe it would help also to describe what the dystopian vision would be. If we have the current technology and we move towards an increasingly technological future, what would that look like?
Yes. So, dystopian almost certainly involves a lack of privacy. Perhaps we have lack of privacy because everything is on servers. The only way the servers can be paid for is with advertising. The only way advertising works is if people are spying on me and using really sophisticated AI to model my psychological state to know everything there is to know about me. That's companies. Maybe the government's doing the same thing at the same time. That would be dystopian. Hypothetically speaking, that might happen someday.
Have you seen Black Mirror?
One of my absolute favorite shows.
Really?
Oh, yes. It's incredibly scary because it's real.
It wasn't too scary for you to watch? I had to stop.
Oh, horrifying. Yes.
Have you been able to watch each and every one?
Absolutely. Oh, yeah.
You're a glutton for punishment.
It probably says something bad about me. And of course, they're exaggerating. All art is to some degree a caricature. But the underlying ideas that they're portraying are, of course, real. And in fact, I said it gets bigger. I can go more about the dystopia, but let me just say something about the dystopia we're in at the moment. I was talking about the spying culture. That's part of our dystopia, the lack of privacy. And it all is driven by the servers. It's driven by the economic model of servers. If you could get rid of that with ledgers, then you get rid of that. I mean, it actually changes things. But there is another thing that we're seeing right now that I think will change. It will probably change with the rise of VR and some other things anyway, but I don't think that's sufficient. I think you actually need the shared worlds I was describing to change it. And since you want to talk about culture, I have read some fantastic sociological, anthropological things recently about what's been going on in our culture right now. The effect of this device, which of course is what Black Mirror is all about, but the effect of this device on the nature of our culture. And the studies that I've been reading have been about millennials and younger, on kids. But it's not because they're young, it's just because they're the early adopters of really living your life on this thing. But the average adult even looks at this thousands of times a day. The result, though, one study that I was reading said that there's all sorts of things that they track and that they change gradually over time, and that in all the last 100 years, they've only seen one point in time where it all suddenly changed, where the culture changed abruptly, and that was when cell phones came out, smartphones came out. And that in every respect, people are isolated, less socially connected because of social stuff on that device. But how does...
They're alone together, to quote Sherry Turkle.
It's true. The scientific data actually make a pretty compelling case. And they even have some interesting studies that get into causality here, which is usually the problem with sociological studies, is that it's purely observational, but they actually do things where you do controlled experiments where you see causality. The more you're using and interacting with people through your phone, the more lonely you feel and the more depressed you feel. And current kids don't want to get a driver's license. I don't know, when I was a kid, that was what every 15 and 16-year-old wants more than anything in the world. Now they don't even want it. They only get it when they're forced to get it. And I've seen this in my nephews. Why? Oh, because I want to sit in my bedroom and just stare at my cell phone or at my computer. I don't want to go anywhere in the car. Why would I want to use a car? This is different. Now that isn't necessarily bad. What is bad is that there's some evidence that cyberbullying exceeds the amount that you have of in-person bullying when people are actually next to each other.
Absolutely.
And there's reasons for it. And there's anonymity reasons. There's also, I can't tell where you're putting your attention when we're with our group. We're never in a group. We're always a whole bunch of one-to-ones at the same time. And I can be gossiping about you behind your back while I'm talking to you.
This is very fascinating that you think about these things. I didn't know how deeply you thought about them. But
a lot more.
There's the of course, you're not experiencing someone in person. You're not getting that tactile feedback, and you're getting them intermediated through layers of technology that's translating all of those signals as best as the computer can, and certainly not good enough to give you an experience of empathic learning.
Yes. So some of that will get fixed. We'll have haptic interfaces. We'll have better VR interfaces. We'll have avatars in VR that come from cameras that are actually looking at your eyes. There's all sorts of cool things that we can do that will make it more and more like being with a person. But you know what? Social interaction isn't just being with a person. It's also being with a person where it's inconvenient for me to suddenly go a million miles away and do something else and come back a millisecond later. So you have fewer distractions when I'm actually with you in person. But when I'm Facebooking with you or I'm texting you, I can be doing a million other things at once, and you're actually not getting a big fraction of my brain at this moment. And even if you could see me, you might not notice that I'm doing the same thing. Actually, right now, what's the big thing that people do in person? We all get together in a party, and what do we all do? We sit there and stare at our phones. This is the old joke, but it's actually true. So the problem is that we're alone together. We're connecting through social media through a cell phone, maybe in person, or maybe we're sitting together in person, but we're actually staring at our cell phones, talking to other people at the same time. Very distracted, never giving any person a very large fraction of our brain. There is the problem that we have a low resolution picture of each other or no picture of each other, and that we can't touch each other. Those are going to be fixed. Better VR goggles, better haptic interfaces, those are going to be fixed. It'll be more like being there. But the problem is that right now, we are seeing, real sociologists are seeing, and anthropologists are seeing, that we can be in the same room and not be together. Because I'm on my phone texting to a million other people, and you're on your phone texting to a different million people. What you need is to get to where you have a shared world that has a set of people in it, and everyone sees everyone else in that set, and that you notice when somebody is being distracted by people outside the set. I think the real problem isn't that the one-to-one connection is bad, it's that we're only getting one-to-one connections through our technology. We're not getting the click connection in graph theory terms, where we're all seeing each other, and we all know that we're all seeing each other, and we all know that we all know that we're all seeing each other. This is something you get in a small group of kids hanging out together in the past that is now being undermined by our current connection technologies.
That's very fascinating. How would you solve that with DLT?
That's what you have to do. The only way to solve it is either ban all cell phones. I'm not in favor of that one. Or we need to be able to create shared worlds. So it's not just a way that I can call you through super VR goggles and see you and see your face, which helps, but we have to be able to have several of us in a virtual environment that are all next to each other, all seeing each other, and all interacting with each other as a group so that we aren't tempted to be constantly interacting with other people elsewhere. So we're going to have shared worlds that are compelling enough that we all want to be interacting with the shared world and with each other. Now, it sounds like I'm talking about VR, and of course VR is useful if you want to use that, but it doesn't have to be VR, but it has to be something that is engaging enough that we're all involved in it.
Just to draw a clear demarcation here, there's the interface component, which is the way that we interface with each other.
Which isn't the important part.
Right.
And then there's the shared world part.
Well, okay,
So for example, video game players right now play these video games in these really poorly drawn worlds, and they have very bad avatars, and they have really bad connections. They don't even have cameras on each other, but they all wear mics on their face, and they talk. And I'm not a gamer, but I've talked to gamers, and what they do is they end up talking about the game, the strategy of how they're going to go shoot people, but then they go off and talk about everything else in life. And they are like traditional teenagers hanging out.
Yeah, that's 100% correct.
And that is the one bright spot in what we were just discussing. This is the place where they're using something, and it's not called social media, it's called gaming, but they're using something that is a different kind of hanging out together because they had something compelling enough, a shared world that was compelling enough to draw them in. And honestly, that shared world is really primitive. There's not a lot of information, there's not a lot you can do, and it's not very good graphics, and yet that's enough to tie them to each other, and while they're playing, they are not texting to friends outside of that clique. You have that small group of kids that are actually talking to each other. I keep saying kids. They're adult gamers, absolutely.
So to be clear, though, what
Yes.
you're really saying the opportunity is that you can do in the future that you hope for,
Yes.
the future where we can distribute this out to the network.
Yes.
It's not that, it's so that you can do this spontaneously, securely, and amongst yourselves. You don't need to rely on
Right.
anyone else. That's the key here, right?
This is the key. So why do ledgers enable this? It allows us to do it securely. Nobody is spying on us. It allows us to do it for free. It allows us to do it spontaneously anytime we want. It will help when we're all walking around wearing sunglasses that are also AR, VR goggles, which is coming not as fast as I'd like, but 5 years from now maybe. But all those things will help. But the real thing that you need is the shared world itself, and that's the ledger. You've got to have the ledger. It's got to not have a server because servers require money. Money requires or advertising, which requires spying. There's a lot of problems with the server. You've got to have this shared world. It's got to be compelling. It's got to be something you have control over. You have to have, now we talk about shared gaming. There's this thing called griefing. So we said that social media undermines socialness. Well, the problem in many forms of gaming is griefing undermines the gaming. Well, how would you stop that? Well, if you had a set of rules that are enforced that prevent people from hurting other people in certain ways, that actually start to reflect the property rights and rules of the real world, that actually starts to help you from, for those who don't know, griefing is vandalizing other people's things in like Minecraft where you're building something. And that means that we need a set of rules. Minecraft is inherently set up so that one kid is the dictator. I think he can actually make other kids be dictators as well, but any dictator can destroy anything in the universe. That's not a good shared world. That is not the right way to build a shared world. The right way to build a shared world is everyone's equal.
This is very fascinating, Leemon. We could have done an entire conversation just on this. And I want to rephrase what you're saying to see if I'm getting it correctly and also to really communicate it to the audience.
Yeah.
We live autonomously to some degree or another, and there have been transformations of the individual in society over centuries, particularly in the West. The East and Eastern traditions have been less individual in that regard. But if we're just talking about Western societies and values, we've seen this remarkable transformation of the individual in society since the Protestant Reformation onwards.
Yeah.
And that has created these individuals.
Yes.
And all of us are individuals.
Yes.
And if these values are important to us, particularly in the United States with the Constitution of the Bill of Rights and the right to privacy, the right to self, autonomy, liberty, these are very important values to us. And if we want to maintain them and hold them in the future, then finding a way to have control over our data and the way that we share information and how we create worlds and where the power resides in this system. Because there's the experience of the technology, and that's not something that DLT is about. It's about, we're talking about VR, we're talking about data processing, analytics, everything. But then where does all that data reside? Where does it get processed? That's what we're talking about here with distributed ledger technology, and that is so essential and important for freedom and autonomy and privacy and security.
Yes. So let's talk about this. Do ledgers allow us to have strong privacy, strong autonomy, controlling your own destiny? Is this a possibility? Yes. So here's what you do. You have things like sovereign identity. I would like to be able to go through life and be able to convince people that I have the authority to do certain things. I took an Uber here and I paid with my credit card. I had to convince the Uber driver that I have a valid credit card. But of course, there's an intermediary that had to know everything about me, including my credit card number, in order to do that. So I gave up some privacy and actually even some control, right? There's more people now that have my credit card number that could actually be spending illegally. I'm trusting them not to, but they have control of my life. But in exchange, I got a ride here. Hey, I like that. I am the world's biggest fan of Uber. But I'm an even bigger fan of disintermediation. So I think that what we need to do is be able to have control of your own things, but then to be able to selectively release things. So I would like to be able to give you the information that I need to do various things. If I need to prove to you that I'm over 21, I want to be able to prove to you that I'm over 21 without showing you my driver's license with my address and my full name and everything else about me. I want to control just what I give you. And ledgers are critical to that. Wait, why would ledgers be critical to that? Why can't I just have a digital form of my driver's license that was signed by the DMV that I have on my phone, and when I go to you and I want to prove that I'm over 21, I somehow do a zero knowledge proof or something? Why can't I just do that? Why do I need a ledger? Do you know why I need a ledger? I need a ledger for revocation. If I want to prove to you that I have a valid driver's license, then I have to somehow prove to you that the DMV didn't just revoke it 10 minutes ago or yesterday. The only way to do that is with a shared ledger that gives us shared information, or a shared server that we all trust. But if we don't want to have to trust one server, then we need ledgers. So ledgers enable revocation services, which enable sovereign identity, which allows me to take control of the information in my life and control who has it. Similar thing for medical records. I would like to be able to have medical records that easily can go from doctor to doctor. When I switch doctors, I want to be able to have everybody has it, but I want to have complete control myself over who has what. And I want to be able to control all those things. And I want to be able to have information out there about if I'm in an accident, you can access these things. Ledgers can be storing information like that. When you get it, if I get in an accident, what do I want to have happen? So we can have ledgers involved in that. We can have ledgers involved in privacy in the sense that if we're using shared worlds and all my data is stored in this ledger, then only the people in the ledger have it. And it has protections on being changed and being sent out to other people in various ways. By the way, you asked earlier, why would you ever want permissioned ledgers? Why not just use public ledgers? Yeah, because permissioned ledgers help me keep my data where I want it to be. When I want it to go out, I can send it out. When I want it to not go out, I can make it not go out. And when I want to delete it, I can at least guarantee that the software running the ledger deleted it. I can never prove that someone didn't make a copy, but I can at least prove that.
And this is, interesting. Another way to think about this is that you're empowering the nodes of the network. If we're the nodes of this emergent network that is coming into being. Leemon, I really enjoyed talking to you. It was great having you here in person.
Yeah.
And I hope we can do this again as the future progresses and as Hashgraph continues to sort of move forward. In particular, if you have some major successes, it would be great to have you here and sort of discuss those.
That'd be great. I've really enjoyed it, and I'd be happy to come back again. Thank you very much.
Thank you for being on Hidden Forces.
Thank you.